Jimmie's going to kick things off. Let's give him a nice warm round of applause.
I think I understood I was supposed to use this. Can everybody hear me? Okay. As I was just introduced, I'm Jimmie Pursell. I'm a commercial litigator. The presentation today, what we're going to talk about is a fairly high-level view of cybersecurity issues from a legal perspective. We're going to talk about the legal aspects of things to consider and some of the practical aspects. What I want to start with, though, this is a live feed in real time of cyber attacks that are going on at this moment around the world. It's tracked by a company called Norse. This website is map.ipviking.com. Andy and I were talking about it before we got started. It's a little bit unusual today. Most of the time that we look at this site, China is the primary originator of attacks and the U.S. is the primary target. Today, it looks like the U.S. is outpacing China, and this is a relatively small number of attacks. Usually, China is in the 5,000 range for the times that I monitor this site. The U.S. is usually in the 1,000 range, and in both instances, it's down, which is interesting. But it's an interesting site to go to if you really want to take a look at the real-time tracking of cyber attacks. First thing we're going to talk about today, now that we've kind of gotten that out of the way, is the scope of the problem. What I want to do is quantify the cybersecurity issue in terms of both dollars and in terms of numbers of incidents that you see. Some of these numbers are going to be, they're primarily for 2014. Some of them are a little bit older because it sometimes takes 12 to 18 months to compile the data on a yearly basis for the organizations that do compile it. But for the last year, 2014, $400 to $575 billion per year worldwide. In the U.S., this is a $100 billion per year problem. That figure, there are a number of things that go into that figure and the types of damages that businesses can incur and the society can incur. You have actual cybercrime that goes into that. Somebody steals a credit card number through some kind of a security breach and uses that to actually defraud either a consumer or a credit card company out of money. That goes into one tranche. That's one type of harm. Another type of harm is the actual cost of responding to a breach that will go into that, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, but that can be significant. And so you're not just dealing with actual money lost through cybercrime types of theft or fraud. You're dealing with hard costs that will be incurred as a result of responding to a breach. 783 data breaches in 2014, and I have to stress, these are data breaches that were reported to the authorities, investigated by some organization that would be relevant to the particular breach, whether it be the FTC, the FBI. I would imagine that if you account for individual computers that were hacked, mom and pops that have problems that don't get reported, that number is going to be astronomically higher than that. Alarming rate, average of 15 breaches per week when you account for this number. If you account for the ones that aren't reported, it's going to be even more than that. The impact is felt across the board. On the left, types of industries, banking, credit, financial, that's an obvious target. Anybody dealing with money is going to be a target for criminals. General business, educational, two that I want to focus on are educational and medical health care. Those two types of entities are particularly ripe targets because they tend to be not as sophisticated when it comes to their security, and they tend to have information that would be valuable to hacker groups that want to obtain personal information on people. For instance, educational institutions will almost always have your social security number, as with medical and health care. Medical and health care are also vulnerable because In this day and age, you have networking that occurs, usually wirelessly, for various devices, from MRI machines to pacemakers, insulin drips, you name it. There's a Wi-Fi connection to it these days, right down to the wireless printer in your doctor's office. And frequently those networks are not as secured as they need to be, and that makes them a prime target for network vulnerability. When you start talking about the larger companies, the actual impact in numbers of accounts can be staggering. eBay, 145 million accounts hacked. Home Depot, 56 million. These are credit card numbers, and usually credit card numbers along with zip codes that can be used to access the credit card, even through some of these security systems that require you to enter additional information. JP Morgan, 76 million, Target, 110 million. It's a big numbers for these large data breaches. The cost, I mentioned this earlier, you're talking not only about the idea that there are fraud numbers that take place where money's taken out of a bank account, but the cost to respond on average last year was $3.5 million. If you're hit with a data breach on a significant scale, now this, of course, the 3.5, that takes into account companies like Target, Sony, which I'm sure everybody has heard about, that drives the average up. But you can expect as a business owner to spend significant amounts of money responding and rectifying that breach. That's up 15% on an average cost per breach since 2013. The average cost per record, per customer record that was lost or compromised in the breach was $201 last year. That means obviously that as the number of customers that you have goes up, you end up increasing this number dramatically, especially for the larger businesses. Let's talk a little bit about the data and the types of risks that are at issue here. I've categorized this into two categories, individuals and businesses. What you're going to find as we get to a couple of later slides is that the type of data that businesses need to protect comes into two categories, but one of those categories, the customer data, is basically the same type of information that individuals are concerned about, and that's why we talk about it here. The biggest vulnerability for an individual is identity theft. There's the direct economic harm that comes from having a credit card stolen, but the bigger hassle comes from having your Social Security number compromised, your identity taken to obtain credit, to obtain any number of other types of services. Rental agreements are a big thing these days in somebody else's name. So that's a problem. As a side note on this, how many of you guys use your debit card online when you go to finance a transaction or to pay for something on PayPal or whatever? Okay. There's one thing that's important to remember on an individual basis. Your credit card, you have fraud protection. Usually your limit of exposure is $50 on a fraudulent use of your credit card. For debit cards, if it's used as a credit card, in other words, it's a non-PIN purchase, you're using it like your Visa card, but it's a Visa debit card, most banks will provide the same level of protection. On the other hand, if you use it as a PIN card, you type your PIN in, then you don't have any fraud protection whatsoever. And I was told a couple of days ago an anecdote about a guy who had his Social Security number compromised. They used the Social Security number to go to the guy's bank, obtain a new PIN number for the credit card, and even though they only had the number, they didn't have physical possession of the credit card, were able to debit thousands of dollars from the bank account with no fraud protection because it was considered a PIN transaction. So that's kind of a cautionary tale for anybody that's using a debit card in a way that might be subject to being compromised, usually online. I've already talked about banking and credit card information. The other thing to think about for individuals is private or embarrassing info or photos. Think about the kind of things you keep on your phone. Most people are fairly tame. I know at least I am, but every now and then there are things that you don't want anybody else to see, either because it's embarrassing, whatever. But let's think about a couple of security issues. How many people, when they came in, connected to the Wi-Fi network here on the guest network? Anybody? Good, because that's an unsecured network. If you come into a Wi-Fi network, you go to your Starbucks and you connect on your smartphone, and bear in mind, we're not talking about just your laptop. We're talking about the phone that everybody, at least this never leaves my hand unless it's in my pocket, right? If it's connecting, then it's potentially vulnerable. This was not really on anybody's mind, and then it happens to Jennifer Lawrence, and then everybody's worried about it. And now nobody's worried about it anymore because we have a national attention span that's too short. These types of things, however, are more than just embarrassing in some cases. What if you have a CEO? What if you have somebody who has something that's compromised, and instead of just releasing it for embarrassment, it's used for blackmail? These are all types of information that needs to be secured and that's of consideration when it comes to things that are at risk. Businesses maintain that same type of information. It's essentially the same information that individuals are concerned about, and we're going to talk about, Andy's going to talk about it a little bit more, but part of the thing to consider as a business is what information are you maintaining, why are you maintaining it, and do you really need it? From a business standpoint, the data that can most likely harm your customers, credit card, bank information is the most direct way, but identity theft information, social security numbers, DOB, that kind of thing, is also at risk. There's some pretty big data breaches that we've talked about. On our list, Sony was not there. Sony had a huge breach, 2011. Millions of credit card numbers and additional information from PlayStation Network accounts and other types of accounts. And there have been class action lawsuits that are probably going to result in some pretty hefty payouts. And so, as a business, these are things that you collect from your customers that you need to maintain the security of. However, businesses have one additional level of concern, and that's their system compromise. We've talked so far about data, and we've talked about cybersecurity in the form of, are you maintaining the security of the information on your systems that belongs to somebody else, in this case your customers. But there are a number of additional types of harm that can come to a business. Vandalism to websites. This is something that actually not only affects businesses, politicians are particularly vulnerable to this. Anybody that maintains a campaign website, every now and then you hear about it. Somebody will hack that website, and sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes there's overt vandalism with profanity or whatever. Other times it's more subtle. Other times they put stuff up that sounds kind of like something this politician would say, but it's not actually their position, but makes them look stupid. And sometimes it goes a little while without being detected because it's so subtle. This is also a vulnerability for companies that depend, as all companies do, on their reputation. In addition to your customers' data, you have your own data. You have your own trade secrets. This can be anything from your customer list, which is part of your customer data, but it's also valuable to you because it's a compilation of customers that are interested in your type of work, in your type of service or product. And so that's something that you want to maintain. System crashes, DDoS. This stands for Dedicated Denial of Service. This type of attack is where your network is overwhelmed by traffic in order to bring your network down and keep others from accessing it. Sometimes it's for a website. It's another form of website vandalism. But there have been a couple that have been really high profile. Anybody here do any video gaming? I'm a huge video gamer. I see a couple of hands. Christmas Day 2014, Lizard Squad Mafia takes down the PlayStation Network and Xbox Live. Most people think, well, not that big a deal. Well, in actuality, all those brand new PlayStation 4s that were being opened up by kids on Christmas morning require a connection to the PlayStation Network to update. So for about a period of 48 hours starting Christmas morning, all those brand new PlayStation 4s were bricks. They were useless. And anybody wanting to play online over the holidays couldn't do it, as I can personally attest. All of this results in reputational damage. in addition to the potential economic loss from theft of your trade secrets, and for system crashes, the lack of revenue that you're going to generate. If you're Amazon.com and you can't take orders, you're in trouble. Last thing I want to talk about in any detail is social engineering. One of the things that's going to be talked about later on, and I'm sure that a lot of you guys that are in the industry, when you think of cybersecurity, you're thinking of, do I have a good firewall? You know, how are my passwords? Are they good, bad, and different, right? But a larger risk, maybe not larger, but a very significant risk is the con man. You know, most hackers these days, they're not Matthew Broderick, as I referenced earlier, who's doing a dial-up connection trying to guess a password. There's somebody who's going to call up your customer service line and say, hey, you know, I'm John from your Des Moines office and our system just went down. I got a customer I'm trying to service and I can't get into the back office, and you know, our system is down. Can you give me the password so I can get into the back office? If somebody calls that, your people need to make sure to think, do we even have a Des Moines office? You know, is this something that is even plausible? And so part of social engineering prevention is training your people not to put their passwords on Post-it notes. There was an Onion headline a couple of weeks ago that said, new password requirements forces grandma to change Post-it note next to her monitor. Well, that's all too true. You know, nowadays, we've gotten smarter. Nobody puts it on their monitor anymore. Now it's on that top desk drawer, you know. And if we know that, then the hackers know it. And there are other things, and Mike is going to talk about this as well. People scamming their way into your company in the guise of being a customer or whatever, and looking at information that's readily available on somebody's desk. These are the kind of things that everybody needs to be conscious of and put proper procedures in place to prevent. Now with that, I'm going to hand it over to Andy. Andy's going to start with regulatory requirements and then segue into preparing for a breach.
We'll start with the regulatory requirements. It's a difficult issue. There's no one comprehensive law. It's really a mix, a patchwork of both federal and state laws, along with best practices and standards that companies need to be aware of. On the federal side of regulation, this is just a small list of some of the most significant areas that companies need to be aware of. The FTC, for example, is focused heavily on maintaining privacy of customer data, ensuring that companies are complying with their privacy policies and obtaining informed consents from their customers. The SEC is certainly, what we're seeing are evolving standards. Many of these companies regulated by these government agencies are subject to heightened or increasing scrutiny. So for example, with the SEC, companies have long had to make disclosures about material risks and incidents. I think that the SEC is looking closer now at disclosures regarding breaches, no longer accepting boilerplate language, and requiring that companies disclose not just incidents, but also material risks in the area of cybersecurity. All of the federal agencies overseeing and governing regulating financial institutions, so the FDIC, Office of Comptroller, N2A, which oversees credit unions, as part of their regular auditing processes. They're looking much closer at the security procedures at these financial institutions. Department of Defense, if you're within a group of critically important defense contractors, you're subject to rapid response or rapid notification requirements in the event of any incident, breach type incident. Obviously the government wants to know about that. HIPAA, high tech, we're all generally familiar with maintaining confidentiality and security of healthcare information. Also applies to critical infrastructure, so our utilities. The government's very focused on maintaining the integrity and security of critical infrastructure such as utilities. Common thread in both privacy and security regulations, maintaining confidentiality, integrity, make sure that information is not manipulated, make sure that it's available for its intended use, and in the area of privacy, making sure that customers are making informed choices and decisions with how companies are using their data. State law, I think there are 46 states and territories that have some variant of a breach notification law. There are some significant distinctions. Some are more onerous than others. If you're a company doing business throughout the nation, it's not as easy as simply complying with the breach notification requirements of the most onerous. It really requires an awareness of all the different standards. Some of the key elements, though, are the breach notification laws are looking at compromise of personally identifiable information, traditionally defined as a name coupled with account information or a social security number. I think that we're going to see an evolving standard there also. We know there are data brokers that can accumulate many different data points based on the devices you're using, where you're doing business, to identify who you are. Another thing, so in the event, most state breach notification laws require a likelihood of harm analysis, and that's going to be the trigger for notification requirements. So as part of any breach assessment, companies need to perform that risk assessment or that harm assessment. A breach does not necessarily trigger a notification requirement, but again, it's going to be state dependent. Also, industry standards are at play. NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, a number of the financial institutions sued Target following that breach, claiming that Target, in a class action, claiming that Target was not implementing reasonable security measures to ensure the integrity of that payment system. So Target is being hit both with class actions from the affected customers, but then also the issuing banks that are going to bear the upfront cost of those merchant accounts. And there's also the question whether or not industry standards or best practices, are they really voluntary? You know, if you're not following those industry standards and you're subject to a class action suit, certainly that's going to be referred to in terms of establishing a failure to meet your duty. Conversely, if you are following the standards, I suppose that an argument could be made that you have implemented reasonable measures and fulfilled legal obligations regards to the security measures you have in place. Jimmy, you want to talk briefly about preparing for the breach?
I wanted to, let's go to the next slide. This is related to some of the stuff that I was talking about, so I want to talk about, interrupt Andy for a minute and talk about just this one slide. One of the first things that you want to do when you start thinking about this this problem is conducting an audit and be proactive, and part of that has to do with inventorying your data and looking at these various issues. And I'm not going to go through these one at a time, but I want to kind of give you the overview and the way to think about this. Inventory your data. What are you collecting? What are your real needs when it comes to data for your customers? There's a general view that more data is always better, and that's not necessarily true. If you're collecting more than you really need, you're having to secure more than you need, and the potential harm that comes from a breach is greater than it needs to be. You have to think about things in addition to what you're collecting and why and whether or not it's appropriate. How is it being stored? Where is it being stored? Is it encrypted? Andy spoke about the safe harbor in Arizona for encrypted data. So these kind of things are things to bear in mind, but also your security measures for this data. Now that you're going through your audit, you've pared it down, I'm only collecting what I'm supposed to collect, have I put proper security measures in place? And this is important not only for the customer data, but for your trade secret data. Because for trade secret, one of the requirements is that you take reasonable steps to maintain the secrecy. What are those reasonable measures? Well, that's part of what Andy was talking about. It depends on your circumstances, and that's a reasonableness question, which is always a question for lawyers. But if you maintain tight security and somebody steals your trade secrets, you still maintain the protection. If Ethan Hunt from Mission Impossible comes into your data room because he's come down the side of Burj Khalifa and he gets your information, well, you're still protected for your trade secret even though it gets out there. On the other hand, if you fail to take those precautions, then you may not have trade secret protection at all. So maintain your security measures. and make sure that you've got tight third-party access. You know who's accessing the data, especially when it comes to vendors. But that's the overview of the audit is, what are you collecting, why, is it more than what you need, and are you adequately protecting it both from an encryption and a security standpoint and from third-party access?
All right, another area to consider in preparing for the breach. So one of my areas of practice is handling coverage issues under various types of financial crime policies. And so I've been handling cyber loss or cyber-related claims for about the last 7 years. And in that 7 years, there's been a lot of development in terms of the carrier's focus on developing cyber-specific policies dependent that are tailored to whatever the risks of your company are. And so part of the preparing for the breach is to conduct essentially an insurance audit to determine what are your risks, what are your threat vectors, and what type of coverages are available. I would not be relying on traditional CGL, D&O, property policies to cover cyber-specific losses. Part of that audit is, are you looking for both first-party damage coverage and third-party liability coverages? And there are, again, cyber-specific policies that can address each one of these areas of loss. This is really, are these risks covered under your CGL and D&O? I guess the answer is maybe. The 2011 Zurich case, Zurich had $60 million in cyber-specific coverage. They sought an additional $2 billion in coverage under their CGL policy, under a sort of esoteric argument that it should be covered under a publication coverage grant. I believe it was the District Court in New York dismissed that lawsuit. Conversely, Northern District of California, in a very similar suit, found in favor of coverage under a CGL. So it's a matter of probably what jurisdiction you're in. D&O is not really tested. There was a class action lawsuit, I believe, that arose here in Arizona against Wyndham. That was ultimately dismissed, and so it never reached D&O coverage issues. It was dismissed under the business judgment rule. I think the takeaway is that as a company, I would not rely on those traditional coverages, CGL, D&O, to cover for cyber losses. I reference this, very specific cyber policies, all the way to cyber extortion. We're holding your system for ransom, pay up or we're not going to give you access back to your system. Again, part of this is to think about, there are some limited coverage under, many businesses have some form of a commercial crime policy. There's some limited coverage, but that's really geared towards the true hacking event where someone gains access to your account and by doing so moves money. It's not going to cover third-party losses. It's not going to cover breach response, and it's also probably not going to cover issues that Jimmy touched on, where there's some element of hacking or some element of computer fraud coupled with really social engineering, con man. You want to know in advance, before a breach occurs, who's going to be on your management and response team. Who are you going to notify once a breach is detected? What are the timelines for making that notification? Who's going to conduct the investigation to determine the scope of the breach and determine what data has been compromised and exposed? At what point are you going to turn that information over to counsel to determine whether or not there's been a sufficient likelihood of harm to trigger notification requirements? If you're a sizable enough company or the risks are large enough, do you want a PR firm already engaged that can handle the public relations issues and hopefully mitigate the reputational damage that will come from a breach? These are all issues that ideally you want to have established in a written plan in advance so that you're not scrambling to make these decisions on the spot. Particularly when it comes to notification, because if you don't have a plan in place, it's certainly going to delay the assessment and then the following notification. It's critically important to have good employee security and training procedures and policies in place. And you can have great policies, but if you're not training your employees then the policies are essentially meaningless. I think Michael will talk about this. We've seen reports that say 80% of breaches can be avoided by reasonable measures. In excess of 40% of breaches are the result of some internal negligence or mistake. These are things that through training our employees and having good policies in place can be avoided. Regularly need to be reviewing your privacy policies and making sure that you're adhering to those. Depending on your company, maybe you want a very narrow policy. We can use customer data for any reason we want to. Other businesses might want to have something that says that they will only use customer data for very limited purposes. Again, reviewing your coverage issues or insurance coverages. Typical policies to have in place, I've really touched on these: privacy policies, identity theft, record retention. What data are you retaining? Do you really need to be retaining it? How long are you retaining it? In what format are you retaining it? Is it feasible to encrypt that data? Then again, touching on training. Part of the breach response plan, you're going to have an incident response checklist. And that goes back to having this plan in place in advance. So you just work, you have dedicated personnel, they're going to work through that checklist in a coherent and reasoned fashion, look at the notification issues, and then restoration, eradication, and then lessons learned. And then part of that is also making sure that you have a well-documented file for litigation defense. One other area that we've seen cybersecurity come up is in M&A. If you're purchasing companies, you're likely purchasing their data. You've got to be looking at the security and data security issues with that also. With that, I'll turn it over to Michael Kelly.
Failure to take reasonable measures to maintain the secrecy of your information by operation of law extinguishes your trade secrets. That's significant because that's true even if they're never breached. If you maintain information, whether it's source code, customer data, aggregate data, if you maintain it as a trade secret and the measures that you use to maintain it are deemed to be not reasonable, then your trade secret is extinguished even if the data was never breached. This translates into our daily lives into a couple of bullet points. One is that the failure to use common security measures may constitute a failure as a matter of law. And these common security measures might mean state-of-the-art software packages, state-of-the-art malware patches. If they're available to you and you don't use them, not only may you be accused of not maintaining the standard of care for negligence purposes, but you lose your trade secrets. Some experts in this field are recommending that we consider using a due diligence questionnaire before disclosing confidential information. Often we'll disclose confidential information pursuant to an NDA. And the NDA will typically require that the recipient use measures to protect my confidential information that are at least as secure as their own measures. Well, what if they don't have any measures? Just a few anecdotal points to raise awareness. Selfies are becoming more and more of a selfies are becoming more and more of a problem. Sometimes they just appear to be self-indulgent and annoying, but you don't know what's behind the person. It could be a chart, it could be a computer monitor, it could be extremely sensitive company assets that someone steals simply under the guise of a stealth selfie. Another bullet point we wanted to include here is reconfiguring or eliminating USB ports, and a lot of people react to that by saying, we can't do that. Well, if you're in the supply chain for the Department of Defense, you have to do that if you want to be qualified as a vendor in a lot of contexts to avoid the circumstance where someone's child's friend walks into an office and inserts a USB drive into a computer. Depending on what's on that USB drive, it can plant a worm or a virus that's going to crawl through the entire system. Reasonable measures may require privacy screens for traveling employees. A lot of us, when a lot of people in this room, I'm sure, travel and work, and if you're working on sensitive information and you don't have a privacy screen, nobody here wants to be the first one to have to litigate that issue. Courts are increasingly citing the use of training programs as evidence of reasonable precaution, both for the preservation of trade secrets and to avoid liability under a negligence standard for failure to maintain the standard of care. Training programs, social engineering programs, awareness programs are quickly becoming a key component of the standard of care. Another bullet point, avoid using fixed period of time. We see that a lot in agreements when confidential and company information is exchanged. The reason why this can be dangerous, a lot of times those agreements are used without thinking, and they require that someone maintain the secrecy of the information up to a certain date or completion of the project, and then for 2 years thereafter. Well, what you've done is effectively extinguish the trade secret status of that information after 2 years, again, whether it is ever disclosed or not. And I know we have at least one IT administrator in this room. Companies are becoming increasingly concerned about the special security risks posed by departing IT administrators. And this dovetails with another point that we're seeing more and more in the literature, which is cybersecurity is no longer a problem that can be wholesale delegated to the IT group. It needs board-level attention to the same extent as sales needs board-level attention, because it's just as critical to the future of the company. We're not going to try and make IT administrators out of the people in this room, and I don't expect that everyone in this room, although some of you I'm sure do, have familiarity with these systems, Nagios, Cacti, etc. But we should at least be aware that system monitoring tools, very robust system monitoring tools, do exist, so that we at least have a record of who has attempted to access source code, customer data, etc., and we can track it in the event of a breach. So what do we do? This can be a little bit overwhelming, and what we're trying to do in this last portion of this presentation is give some hope. Some commentators have been saying that it's not a question of if, but when you personally and you in your capacity as a professional are going to be breached and be responsible for answering for that breach. We still like to cling to the notion that 80% of breaches were avoidable. So the point of these last slides is what we can do to help make ourselves, our companies, and our families the locked doorknob. So as a hacker is walking through trying to find an unlocked door, they're going to get to your door and it's going to be locked, and they're going to move on to the next one. SANS is an organization that has developed the CSIS 20 critical security controls. These have not been formally adopted by anyone. However, I note that they are posted on the wall at the cybersecurity warfare range. These are the 20 security controls against which hackers that are being trained to hack. And we're going to run through them real quickly just to try and personalize them and give each of the people in here just a little bit of a sense of what a comprehensive program of controls for an organization will do to mitigate your exposure, at least as best we know how to today. Number one, an inventory of authorized and unauthorized devices sounds like a logical place to start. What's on the network? Should it be there? And if it's not, get it off. Number one applies to devices. Number two applies to software. Track application and operating system versions. If someone has an authorized operating system but an unauthorized version, that should raise a red flag that there may be someone planning a security breach. Number three, secure configurations for those devices. Just knowing that the device is approved doesn't necessarily mean it's been installed or employed in an approved or a safe manner from a security standpoint. Number four, continuous vulnerability assessment is a theme that is increasingly being addressed by the experts in this area. To personalize that, the point is that a penetration test, no matter how good it is just a snapshot at the instant the penetration test was conducted. A system that's free of vulnerabilities today may be fully exploitable tomorrow. Number five, malware defenses. There are companies that spend a lot of time tracking viruses and addressing those through malware patches. The point is, if the patches are there but you're not implementing them and hardening your systems with those patches, then you're vulnerable, even though there's a patch available. You got to use it. Application software security. For developers and integrators, it's common that they'll run their own code through a security test to make sure that it's appropriately patched and hardened. It's also common that those developers will use third-party DLLs and third-party libraries that they just presume have been security checked. It's no longer safe to presume that. Number 7, wireless control devices. There's a lot of wireless control devices that on their surface appear harmless, MP3 players, etc. Most of them have the ability to attach to your network. So DoD policies, for example, require that those devices either be not allowed to come into the company where the workforce and customers have access to, but if they are, then have that wireless capability effectively disabled, airplane mode. Hackers commonly employ backdoors, Trojans, and spyware to provide alternate access when the initial vulnerability is closed. An analogy here that brings this point home to me, you're all familiar with the technique that terrorists use to use a first bomb to draw in first responders so they can assess your response. Just because you may have a breach and you think you got it doesn't mean that you got it. It could mean that you've just now shown your cards as to what your defense is for the next breach that ought to be coming once they know how you've responded. Security skills assessment and appropriate training. Andy talked about that, particularly with the social engineering password protection. If you're not using it, it may not be helping you. More importantly, if you're not using it and you're not monitoring the effectiveness of it, and some of the authors are recommending periodic quizzes, if you're not monitoring it, again, query whether you're maintaining the standards of care that are going to be applicable to you and your industry when there is a breach. Number 10, it's easy to overlook, but the point of it is, if you've assessed the security of all your devices and all your applications and your software, have you also done the same thing with the system infrastructure that those devices ride on? Your routers, firewall, switches, etc. Those are key targets as well as the devices that actually contain the data. Number 11, limitation and control of network ports, protocols, and services. The personalization point here is that a targeted service or application can't be exploited if it's not running. A lot of these services don't need to be running. Sometimes they're only running during nighttime batch processing. Sometimes they're only operating 5 minutes out of every 24-hour cycle. Well, they should be disabled or turned off when they're not running. Otherwise, you've got an access point, a penetration vector that you're not gaining anything from. So we just need to be aware of that and adopt the discipline of disabling penetration points when they're not being used. Control of administrative privileges should be limited in scope. If there's a breach and you can say, well, it was done by this security level with this level of administrative privileges, but you can't point to an individual, we're still not there. Boundary defense, this relates to the screen that was on when you all walked in. Real-time boundary attacks. They have to be logged and monitored even when there's no threat of a breach, so that we have a baseline against which to compare when there is a breach. It's also recommended that we consider using multiple logs, logging events from through multiple different lenses in the event the information is the hackers attempt to alter it at the source. So that if you can triangulate it, even if they've corrupted, for example, their IP address, we can still get enough information to identify and pursue the hackers and mitigate the breach. Controlled access based on need to know, that's been covered by Andy and Jimmy. Account monitoring and control. Hackers hunt for inactive or suspended accounts. It sounds too obvious to say that when an employee leaves an organization, his credentials should also be immediately terminated. Often that gets overlooked, and hackers know that. Hackers even know when someone has left an organization by monitoring their Facebook page and their LinkedIn. They'll know in real time when someone has left your organization. We just need to make sure those accounts are disabled. Those are favorite targets. 17. In terms of mitigating the magnitude and the scope of a risk, it's important to be able to quickly determine the scope of attack so we can address reporting it and fixing the breach. And this relates to the previous 16 slides. If you do those, you're going to be in a good position to mitigate the financial impact to your organization once there is a breach. Detect, contain, eradicate, and restore, the buzzwords of number 18. This goes to the breach response plans that Andy talked about. If there's a breach and your site goes down or access to critical information goes down, you still have an ongoing business. You may have prevented the hacker from any further access. You still need that data in order to operate your business. What steps have you taken to make sure you can migrate to a safe server in the event you have to bring yours down because of a breach? Secure network engineering simply means that these concepts need to be taken into account in advance as you're engineering your networks so that they can be intelligently compartmentalized to limit a breach so it doesn't spread, analogous to having internal firewalls. The last point that the 20 critical security controls recommends is penetration testing and red team or white hat team exercises. That's what they do down at the Arizona Cybersecurity Warfare Range. It's just like a shooting range. They bring in people and they train them to hack, and then they invite them to be creative in their hacking so that they can build forensics libraries and forensics models for then reverse engineering how it happened and how it can be fixed. It's recommended that you employ some kind of ethical hacking or red team exercises to attempt to exploit the systems that you have in place so that we can assess their effectiveness and remediate them. So with that, we hope we've given you at least, number one, scared hell out of you, but I think you already got that. But two, give you some hope that by employing some of these state-of-the-art, particularly these CSIS 20 security protocols, we can be the people that have the doorknobs locked, and when the hackers are out to hack, they'll go on to your competitor and not to you. And if there's any questions, we're happy to take them either up here or offline after the presentation. With that, I thank you all for attending.